First of all, something I should have done earlier is to acknowledge the help of Sally Burns, who's making everything possible. Thanks, Cheryl. Let me also begin by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Darug Nation, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also pay my respects to and express my appreciation to Indigenous persons who are present here today. I'd just also like to say how nice it is to be presenting with Mike again. It's been a long time since we did so, but we did so many times in the past, and it's good to be doing it again. I'd also like to note that having committed to 17.5 minutes, the average length of presentation so far has been 21.5 minutes, and as a Democrat, I will obviously, follow the path. The paper I'm giving today comes out of a larger project focused on points of connection and difference between Foucauldian and Bourdieusian approaches to art-power relations, especially their different takes on the concepts of field, discourse and apparatus. Today I'm going to focus mainly on the Foucauldian perspective of governmentality, relating this to selected aspects of the public career of Indigenous art, but in doing so make connections with the greater influence that Bourdieu's work has had on these issues, especially through the work of people like Fred Myers, his painting culture, and Laura Fisher, her work on Aboriginal art in Australian society. And I want to set things going by recalling an influential remark from Una Ray, who, when recollecting on his experience with managing a number of art centres of the Western Desert art movement, argues that their accomplishment had been purchased at the cost of their engagement with what he calls, quote, the new canvas economy of a distant art world constituted by varied forms of late 20th century abstraction. This was, Ian MacLean argues in his Rattling Spears, a canvas economy that involved a Faustian bargain in which success in the international art market eclipsed the spiritual significance of the relations between country and culture that the canvases depicted. It fell to art centre managers, he says, to negotiate the terms of this bargain. It was they, MacLean argues, who were, and I quote, the hinge in the exchange between capital and dreaming, end of quote. But there was and still is another side to the exchanges between the canvases of the Western Desert art movement, to the exchanges in which the canvases of the Western Desert art movement have been involved, one, so to speak, between the state and dreaming, presenting a Faustian bargain of a different kind. The 2002 National Museum of Australia Connection exhibition, flagging the theme of country and culture in its entry notice, engaged with this theme by projecting varied depictions of country by Indigenous artists ranging from Emily Cam Warre to Rover Thomas onto the walls and floors of the exhibition hall. This is a photograph I took there. The Faustian bargain here then, I want to go on to what Margot Neal had to say about the target demographic for that exhibition. The projections on the wall were accompanied by soundscapes evoking scenes of song, dance and ceremony from the different countries represented in the exhibition, which, as Margot says there, was intended to outreach to a new demographic. The Faustian bargain involved here, then, concerns the role of the mediating discourses and institutions which act as the hinge in these and other exchanges between the state, in this case via the National Museum of Australia, and the dreaming, which obviously I'm using as shorthand for Indigenous culture, country, and so on. Jennifer Biddle, in a work written some time ago, underscored the potential cost of such bargains in pointing out how curatorial practices which seek to make such canvases accessible to non-Indigenous viewers store them in ways that undermine their distinctive effective force. Citing a 2001 exhibition of Kathleen Petiara's work in which her paintings were accompanied by a whole series of what Jennifer calls representations of the real, including cartographic maps of country, Jennifer takes issue with these for privileging what she calls a Western cartographic visuality over the culturally specific and somatic ways of seeing that Petiara's canvases enact. In converting their distinctive painterly qualities into terms accessible to Western knowledge systems, such storying practices undermined a textuality that in its relations to land rights issues at the time had both refused and contested, quote again, the jurisdiction of the state. I agree with this analysis, but I want to push into the issues involved in the relationships between the state and dreaming. It's likely, I don't know whether it's true, Jennifer will tell us, that the map referred to there is the 1996 IATSIS map, the use of which in museum and gallery exhibitions has continued unabated since, albeit not unqualified and indeed challenged, by a range of indigenous counter-cartographic practices, which we saw again in Jennifer's earlier session, and of which I'll say a little bit more later. But let me relate what I've said so far to why in my title I place a slash between art and power. What I've tried to give a sense of so far is how the agency attributed to the same canvases has varied, in view of the ways in which they have been entangled with three different regimes of power. Those internal to specific indigenous communities, or internal to the way in which they contest forms of power brought to bear upon them. Those arising from the relations between capital and dreaming. A good example of Pierre Bourdieu's logic of the pure gaze. Yeah, I won't go into the capital and dreaming, the reception of indigenous art in international codes of abstraction is a good example of what Bourdieu had in mind by the pure gaze. And the relations associated with functioning of indigenous art and the relationships between the state and dreaming, which I want to interpret through the lens of what I've called civic seeing. These examples then illustrate ways in which, while the form of agency that art exercises vary in accordance with how the dispositional qualities of the canvas or canvases are not negated but refracted in particular directions through their interactions with varied regimes of power via the institution's discourses and infrastructures through which their production, distribution, and reception are mediated. And I'll just make a little bit of a nod there to Adorno's prisms. So with this in mind, I want to air some concerns concerning the operation of art-power relations in the context of governmental forms of power. Just a brief reminder here that, first of all, in his characterization of governmental forms of power, Foucault makes reference to the role of knowledges and apparatuses. I've been very much concerned with the role of particular knowledges, how they operate in the context of museums, art galleries, and so on. And the forms of governmental power that arise from museum and gallery deployments of specific knowledges. But also, briefly to draw attention to the twin aspects of Foucault's concept of governmental power, one in which it operates on conduct through the intervention, through the manipulation of milieux, through the manipulation of the conditions between populations, ways of life, conditions of life, nature, and so on, and often doing so in ways that go behind the backs of actors, to borrow an Althusserian phrase, but it's not operating on conduct through the agency of kind of like consciousness, but through the manipulation of conditions of existence. But also his interest in the ways in which governmental power operates through the population seen under the aspect of its opinion, ways of doing things, forms of behavior that one gets a hold on through education campaigns and convictions. Okay, to exemplify a reading of the art-power relations, drawing on the concept of milieu, I want to take a distinction that Josephine Berry makes between artworks according to whether they act in conjunction with the tethering of life dynamics to particular normalizing regimes or effect a break with such regimes. This is an argument which draws on the political inflection which in his lectures on the abnormal Foucault gives to Georges Canguilham's account of life's vitality as arising from its capacity both to establish new norms and to disturb them, the vitality which for Foucault is staunched through the stabilizations affected by life's subjection to particular biopolitical governmental norms. Berry applies this perspective to the relations between Manet and Manet by suggesting another way of reading Manet's engagement with the new forms of urban and industrial life that T.J. Clark highlights in his discussion of Edward Manet's 1874 painting, Claude Monet and His Wife, in his workshop Boat. And this is what Clark has to say about that painting. Clark's interest centres on Manet's depiction of Monet as having turned away from the scene of industry in the background in order that he might, in the painting he is working on, depict a landscape that is unsullied by its presence. It is this painterly problematic of the landscape genre that for T.J. Clark, Manet calls into question. In glossing this passage, Berry argues that in immunizing beauty in the face of the transformative, albeit destructive force of capitalist development, Monet's canvas is tethered to the normalization of a particular regime of biopower through which the vital dynamics of life are immunized against further transformation. By contrast, she argues, Manet's inclusion of the impending industrial transformation of the landscape scene exercises an anti-normalizing force. To relate this perspective to Indigenous art power entanglement requires an inversion of Berry's Manet-Monet juxtaposition. For it is precisely in the pastoralist landscape that has been cleared of Indigenous presence, this famous example, it's precisely this that symbolizes the encroachment of colonial power, giving rise to a wide range of different Indigenous art practices, which by repopulating the landscape with the scenes of colonial slaughter, Julie Goff's famous work there, call into question the normalization of colonialism associated with such landscapes. An equally telling example is constituted by the varied political aesthetic responses of what Jennifer Biddle refers to as the remote avant-garde to the new forms of governmental regulation that were applied to remote Indigenous communities through the Northern Territory intervention. I won't go into detail here. The point I want to make concerns the respects in which the art practices in question, and I have in mind particularly Rhonda Unarupa Dick's My Great-Grandmother's Country series, the respect in which those artworks were shaped by their contestation of the intervention's biopolitical governmental problematics defined by the relations between a racially defined population whose allegedly delinquent habits and ways of life were to be acted on through varied compulsory techniques of emergency government rather than through the cultivation of individualized forms of self-control attributed to white liberal subjects. Okay, but it's the state dreaming relationship that I want to focus on. And in doing so, I want to, where am I going next? I'm going to skip that. I'll come back to that in a minute. In looking at state dreaming relationship, I'm interested in the role that what clumsily I call the country culture couplet, representations of Indigenous conceptions of the relations between country and culture, play as a governmental actor fostering different forms of civic seeing in which a range of Indigenous art practices are now entangled. In referring to the country culture couplet as a governmental actor, I have in mind not the role it plays within and for specific Indigenous communities, but the respects in which, in effecting a set of strategic relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledges, it now acts, or has until recently, acts as an agent for renegotiating the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Its role in this regard is quite recent. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but I noticed I left Australia after my first period here in 1998, which was the date of the first welcome to Parliament in New South Wales Parliament. And when I came back in 2009, I was just struck by the overwhelming presence of country and culture, references to country and culture in Australian public culture in ways that were not there to anything like the same degree in the mid-1990s. It's a huge topic. I want to make just a few points arising out of ongoing work on the negotiation of the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledges that inform the role accorded the country culture couplet and the concept in varied decolonizing curatorial critical practices across a range of different exhibition formats, crossing the museum gallery divide. That's what I want to do. It's what I haven't done yet. The kinds of exhibitions that I'm interested in are the 2017 Songlines Tracking the Seven Sisters, the current exhibition of Emily Kamwari's work at the National Gallery of Australia. And I'm interested in the ways in which the Indigenous curators of these practices, as well as dealing with what Jennifer called kind of like wanting to, it's a phrase I noted down, with the power of art on country. I'm interested in the ways in which these curatorial practices also have a kind of like a conversational space between Indigenous knowledges and non-Indigenous knowledges, insofar as they're addressed in the main to non-Indigenous publics. First then, let me go back to the IATSIS map, undoubtedly drawing on a Western cartographic visuality, and one that has been challenged in many different ways. For example, by Josephine Mick's Seven Sisters songline, stressing the flow of cultures across different countries, that was used as the entry to the songlines exhibition. But this map, the IATSIS map, is also based upon a fusion of Western and Indigenous conceptions of country-cultural relations. This is a map that draws upon and adapts. It's an adaptation of the culture area mapping tradition associated with the Boasian tradition in American anthropology, and that was introduced into Australia via Clark Whistler, a member of that school of anthropology, who worked collaboratively with Norman Tyndale, whose 1970 map provided a template for this map. This is one amongst many different interfaces between between Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledges that I've been identifying in looking at the public functioning of the country-culture couplet. I've talked a little bit through the anthropological one. The second set of connections is with and transformations of Western archaeological conceptions of deep time, initiated by the work of John Mulvaney, connecting to Indigenous conceptions of ancestry, and more recently, although it points in a different direction, to the conceptions of the everywhen, and the significance that these exchanges between Western archaeological conceptions and Indigenous conceptions of ancestry have played in producing a prospectively different temporal anchorage for the nation than that of British imperial time. Okay? Third, I'm interested in a set of connections that has become more prominent as the debates over climate change become more urgent, in the stress that is placed on country as encompassing the relations between human, animal, and plant forms of life. And there are many texts in which this is connected with the refashioning of the anthropological culture concept that's associated with the Turian revisions and conceptions of nature cultures, moving away from a culture concept to conceptions of nature cultures. And these debates have been ongoing and very public, particularly as initiated by the work of Bruce Pascoe. Fourth, something that's prompted by the stress placed in the Rivas Biennale on Indigenous conceptions of rivers as ancestral beings capable of strengthening the connections between the different peoples who live alongside them. And the respects in which, this is something I've really only just come across by an article that Howard Morphy passed on to me recently, concerning the ways in which current conceptions of the relations between country and culture occupy a point of mediation between Indigenous and Christian theologies. And this is something that features in the work of Stanley. And finally, the role played by the couplet in negotiating relations between what in Western terms are the oppositions between country and city. Okay, that's significant in the work of Raymond Williams. And there are many, this is, I showed this earlier on, this is a National Museum of Australia, Great Southern Land Gallery, which sets itself up in terms of negotiating the relationships between Indigenous conceptions of country as something that, and Western conceptions of country as something that's different from a city, whereas that's not true for Indigenous conceptions of country. And these issues are negotiated hugely in Indigenous literature. For example, in Larissa Berendt's most recent novel, After Story. So the concept of civic seeing, which is a part of a perspective that I've developed in work some decades ago about thinking about museums and art galleries as civic laboratories or civic engines, which act on populations. I'm concerned with the role in which these different aspects of the relations between country and culture is mobilized in exhibition practices, the ways in which they are seeking to revise Australian forms of civic seeing in ways that have been oriented toward a readjustment or a renegotiation or the decolonization of the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. But I want, in my last 2.5 minutes, to close with a Bourdieusian question that is rarely asked within the Foucauldian tradition, that will also connect with some of the points that Mike was making in this paper. And namely, that is to say, when we're thinking about the exhibition practices of Australian museums and art galleries, but particularly art galleries, the question of who, so to speak, is entangled in these entanglements of the relations between art and power, constituted by the public career of the country-culture coupler. A couple of quotations from a project that I was involved in, together with a lot of colleagues from a number of universities, but principally the ICS, Australian Cultural Fields, a project that did a national survey of cultural attitudes, engagement with arts, literature, and so on in Australia. These are a couple of quotations relating to the conversion of the abstraction imputed to remote Indigenous canvases into stories by non-Indigenous Australians. This is a kind of like the relationship between the state and dreaming taking the form of stories that have a public currency. There are many quotes from this project in which this is what non-Indigenous Australians were taking from Indigenous art, not the abstraction, but its conversion into stories that they could relate to. Both of the quotations are taken from people who were in their 30s and 40s. They were both university educated. They both had postgraduate qualifications. One was already in a professional occupation, and the other was heading toward one. And something that the study also showed was the relatively low rate of participation outside of the professional and middle classes, the relatively low rate of participation in art institutions of people from outside those classes. Working class participation in those institutions in Australia was and is negligible. The same was true for the Indigenous members of the sample, but participation in the art institutions was much higher amongst professional Indigenous Australians than it was among those who were in working occupations. So that's the point of confluence that I'm interested in exploring, so far as the relationships between Foucault and Bourdieu are concerned. I think, and again to connect with the point that Mike was making, I think that Pierre Bourdieu's conception of the relationships between art and power is too singular a one, not just in terms of how it connects with different kind of like forms of ruling class power and so on, but that by and large Bourdieu is principally concerned with the ways in which various forms of art are legitimated and the forms of power that they then exercise in relationship to, in the main, class divisions. One of the things that attracts me about Foucault's work in relationship to art power is that he has a much more historically varied conception of power and the ways in which art might be entangled within it. That said, these are not questions that Foucault explores in his work that much. But there are interesting lines of analysis being developed by various post-Foucauldian theorists who take his writings on art and literature and so on, which by and large he ceased to write upon these topics when it came to doing discipline and punish. But they take his concepts, they take his later concepts, governmental power, disciplinary power, and so on and so forth, and see how they can rephrase the central question that Foucault put to art, which was not what power relationships shape art, but what is it that works of art do in the context of power relations. And that's what I've tried to touch upon a little bit. I will stop there, but if anyone wants to ask me what the next slide is about, I'll tell you.
Yeah.